When you're working on a photo in Photoshop, have you ever wondered where to start and what to do next? Then you're in the right place. In this short series of Adobe tutorials, we'll walk you through a no-frills, basic photo editing workflow that you can use to make your own photos look their best, even if you're new to Photoshop. It's often a good idea to start your workflow by cropping your photo to get it framed up just the way you want it before making a lot of adjustments. To crop or straighten a photo, select the Crop tool here in the Tools panel. That creates this crop boundary around the entire image. Before you adjust the crop boundary, I suggest you go up to the Options bar and uncheck Delete Cropped Pixels. That way, anything that gets cropped away won't be deleted permanently, so you can change your mind about it after the crop. Now press the Shift key on your keyboard and drag from any of the corners inward. When you hold the Shift key like that, the crop boundary changes, but it maintains the same aspect ratio of width to height as the original photo, which is a good idea if you want the crop to be the same shape as a typical photograph. If you prefer, you can drag any of the edges independently. So that sets the crop boundary. Next, you'll position the photo inside that boundary by clicking inside the boundary and dragging. Now, unless you shoot with a tripod, your photo may need some straightening. One way to fix that is to look for something you think should be straight, like the horizon in this photo. And then move your cursor just outside any of the corners of the crop boundary until it changes to a curved double-pointed arrow. Then drag to rotate the image inside the crop boundary. And you can use this grid that appears as a guide to help you get things straightened up. To finish up your cropping and straightening, go up to the Options bar and click the check mark, or you can just press Enter or Return on your keyboard. Now let's say that you save the image and you close it and you come back tomorrow. Even then, you could change this crop at any time because you had unchecked Delete Cropped Pixels. Often that's all you'll need to do to crop and straighten a photo, but there are a few other cropping options you may find helpful. Let's switch to another photo to explore those. Another way to straighten a photo is to use the Automatic Straighten option here in the Options bar for the Crop tool. I'm going to select that icon and then come into the image, and I'll click and drag along part of this horizon line to straighten the horizon. And that rotates the photo for me automatically inside the crop boundary. Notice that rotating the photo created some transparent pixels around some of the edges, represented by this checkerboard pattern. If I want to include more in the photo, I can drag any of the edges to include the checkerboard area, and then go up to the Options bar and check Content Aware. And that will cause Photoshop to automatically create content to match the rest of my image. It's really magical. Let's click the check mark and see how it does. One more thing you may find helpful is the ratio menu here on the left side of the Options bar. If you have a particular aspect ratio to which you want to crop, for example, square or maybe 8 by 10, then you can select that here, and then you can change the crop boundary to make it surround just the area that you want to include, but it will always stay in that same aspect ratio. If you want to switch from a portrait orientation like this to a landscape orientation, go up to the Options bar and click the double-pointed arrows here, or just press X on your keyboard. And then you can reposition the photo inside the crop boundary as you like it. So that will often be the first step in your photo editing workflow, cropping and straightening your photo to frame it just the way you want it before you go on to make more adjustments. Sometimes a photo will have an unnatural-looking overall color called a color cast, which comes from the lighting under which you shoot the photo. For example, if you take a photo under fluorescent lights in an office, it may look too green overall. Or if you have a camera or a phone that shoots underwater, you may get a photo that looks too blue. Now, sometimes you might like that effect, but when the subject is something like food, it can look unappealing. So let me show you a quick method to neutralize a color cast that you don't want. go to the Layers panel, and if your Layers panel isn't open, go up to the Windows menu at the top of the screen and choose Layers. At the bottom of the Layers panel, click the Add Adjustment Layer icon and choose Levels from the pop-up menu. That adds a Levels adjustment layer above the layer that was selected. Now, it's a good idea to get in the habit of making adjustments with adjustment layers rather than directly to a photo, because adjustment layers give you the flexibility to refine an adjustment later. When you added the Levels adjustment layer, the Properties panel probably popped out, and it contains controls for the Levels adjustment layer that we just added. Now, here's the quick color correction trick. In the Properties panel, go to the eyedroppers and click on the middle eyedropper, which is the gray eyedropper. Then move into the image and click on something that you think should be neutral gray. This will neutralize the color on which you click and shift all the other colors in the scene around that neutralized color. In this case, it shifts the overall color away from blue and toward a warmer yellow-orange, which I think makes the food look more natural. If you don't get a look that you like the first time you click, try clicking in other spots, and you'll get a slightly different color every time because the result depends on the color on which you click. This method works best when there's a gray object in the scene, but if there isn't, try clicking on something that should be black or white. If you think the change is too strong, you can always go back to the Layers panel, and with the Levels adjustment layer selected, go to the Opacity slider and drag to the left to lower the opacity of that adjustment. Now, this isn't the only color correction method in Photoshop. A Photoshop Pro would probably use a more precise and complex method using something like color curves. But this is a quick method that will often help reduce an unwanted color cast so that your photos look more like the scene you remember shooting. Many photographs can be improved by increasing contrast and fine-tuning brightness, and Levels gives you one way to do that in Photoshop. Here's an example of a photo that has a pretty common problem. It looks dull or lacking in contrast. In other words, there isn't much difference between the lightest tones and the darkest tones in the photo, and it's slightly lacking in overall brightness too. To fix both problems, let's apply a Levels adjustment layer. Start by going to the Layers panel and making sure that the layer that contains the photo is selected. Then, create a Levels adjustment layer by going to the bottom of the Layers panel and clicking this New Adjustment Layer icon and choosing Levels from the pop-up menu. That creates a Levels adjustment layer just above the photo layer. With your Levels adjustment layer highlighted in the Layers panel, take a look at the Properties panel that popped open. If you don't see your Properties panel, then go up to the Window menu at the top of the screen and choose Properties. Take a look at this chart in the Properties panel. It's called a histogram, which is a grayscale illustration of all the possible tonal values in an image. The far left of this scale is for pure black tones, and the far right is for pure white tones, and the area in between is for a range of gray tones. This white hill illustrates where the actual tones in this photo fall on the scale. The hill is really made up of vertical bars that are packed tightly together, with each bar representing a particular tonal value in the photo. So in this photo, we see no bars on the right, which means there are no bright white tones in the image. And we see no bars on the left, which means there are no dark black tones either. And the tallest bars are packed pretty tightly together toward the middle of the scale, which means there's a narrow range of mostly middle gray tones in the image, which is why the photo looks so flat or lacking in contrast. Ideally, we'd like there to be a wider range of tonal values across this tonal scale, including some pure whites and some dark blacks. The good news is that we can get that result by moving the black slider and the white slider here underneath the histogram. Let's start by dragging the white slider over to the left until it's just under this hill of tonal values, and that pushes the brightest pixels in the photo to pure white with no detail. Now, normally you don't want to clip important bright details out of a photo, so here's a little trick that you can use to visualize exactly which pixels you're clipping as you move this slider. Let's drag the white slider back over to the right and do it again, this time holding down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows, as you drag the white slider to the left. At first, you'll see some spots of color, and then you'll start to see some white spots. It's the white spots you're interested in because those show you where the photo is being clipped to pure white with no detail. You want to drag this slider until you see just a few spots of white. So if you get too many white spots, you can ease the white slider back over to the right so you're not losing too much highlight detail. Now do the same thing with the black slider. You can hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows as you drag the black slider over to the right. And when you see some small spots of black, you'll know which pixels you're pushing to pure black with no detail. Now take a look at the photo, and you'll notice that it looks more contrasty or less dull than when we started. And if you want, you can fine-tune the results visually. So I'd like a little less contrast, so I'm going to back the black slider off to the left a bit. And I don't want to clip as many white areas, so I'm going to drag the white slider back to the right a bit. The photo looks better, but it's still a little dark for my taste. To fix the overall brightness of the photo, you can drag the gray slider here under the histogram. I want this photo to be a little lighter than where it started, so I'm going to take it to the left to just about there. I'm going to click the eye icon at the bottom of the Properties panel to compare this final after view with the before view. And back to the after view again. To finish up, save the photo in a format that retains layers, like the PSD or TIFF format. That's how to use levels to enhance a dull photo by improving both its contrast and its brightness. Sometimes you can give a photo that little extra something that will make it really pop by increasing the color intensity or color saturation in the photo. And you can do that not only to the overall photo, but also to particular colors in the photo without even having to make a selection. To do that, go to the Layers panel, and at the bottom of the Layers panel, click the Add Adjustment Layer icon, and from the pop-up menu, choose Hue Saturation. That adds a hue saturation adjustment layer above the selected layer, and it opens the Properties panel with controls for that hue saturation adjustment layer. To increase the overall saturation or color intensity in the photo, go to the Saturation slider and drag to the right. And as you can see, that's saturating everything. So even if I get the sky to the saturation level that I want, the foreground looks too saturated. So that's not going to work in this photo. Let's put saturation back to 0. And try another way. Go to the menu labeled Master, and here you see a list of color ranges. It's likely that the sky contains blues, so I'm going to select blues. If you look at the bars at the bottom of the hue saturation adjustment layer, the top bar is showing you the color range that's going to be affected now when I increase saturation. You can see that doesn't include reds and oranges and yellows and greens that we have in the foreground. It's just a range of blues. So if I drag the saturation slider over to the right now, only the sky and the hills in the background get more saturated, and I can really crank that up without affecting the foreground. And if I change the hue or the lightness slider, that will affect just the blues in the image too. So let's try dragging the lightness slider over to the left to make the blues a little darker. Now that I have the blues the way I want them, let's concentrate on the colors in the foreground. If I try to affect those the same way, by going up to this menu and looking for a range of colors to affect, I don't see a range that seems to correspond to what I see in the photo. There's no listing of oranges there. So instead, I'm going to close that menu by clicking off of it and select this tool, the Targeted Adjustment tool. With the Targeted Adjustment tool, I'll go into the image and I'll click on a color in the foreground. Keep your eye on the Hue Saturation panel as I drag to the right over the foreground color and notice that the saturation slider is moving. And in the image, the only colors affected are those on which I've clicked. In other words, I'm not affecting the blues, I'm affecting a range of oranges or reds instead. Now, that's too much saturation for my taste, so I'm going to take that back a little, maybe to just around here. So that's how you can affect the saturation, the lightness, or even the hue of a particular range of colors in a photo. Almost every photograph can use some sharpening because the very process of taking a photo from capture to output softens the image. To sharpen this photo, start in the Layers panel and make sure that you have the layer selected that you want to sharpen. Let's zoom in to 100% so we can accurately judge our sharpening settings in the document window. A quick way to zoom to 100% is to go to the Zoom tool in the Tools panel and double-click it. Now go up to the Filter menu and choose Convert for Smart Filters so that you're sharpening in a flexible way that you can change later if you want to. And click OK. Now go back to the Filter menu and choose the Sharpen category of filters. In this category, you'll usually use either Smart Sharpen or Unsharp Mask. Smart Sharpen is similar to Unsharp Mask, except that it offers some more advanced options. So for this tutorial, we'll use Unsharp Mask. By the way, don't be confused by the name Unsharp Mask. It's just a term taken from a process that film photographers used to use. I'll click Unsharp Mask, and that opens the Unsharp Mask dialog box. It's worth taking a minute to set things up so that you can see as much as possible as you sharpen. So move into the image where your cursor changes to a square box like this, and click on an area of detail that you want to make sure is sharp. And that area appears here as a preview in the Unsharp Mask dialog box. You can also move the dialog box by clicking on its title bar and dragging, just to get it out of the way so you can see more of the image in the document window. You'll be using a combination of the 3 sliders in the Unsharp Mask dialog box to sharpen this image. So that you can see what these sliders do, I'm going to start by really exaggerating them, dragging the amount slider way over to the right, and taking the radius slider further over to the right than I normally would too. If you take a look at the image here, you can get a sense of how sharpening works. Photoshop looks for image edges where there are dark pixels next to light, and it exaggerates the contrast at those edges by surrounding the edges with lighter and darker pixels. And these are called halos. You can see the halos here, and there's some here as well. Now you want these halos to do their work of increasing the edge contrast so the image looks sharper overall, but you don't want the halos themselves to be showing. So to get to that result, you'll adjust the amount and radius sliders, which we'll do in a second. But while we have these sliders cranked up so high, let me show you what the threshold slider is for. If you look closely at the image, you'll see that there is some grain showing in the sky. We don't want this grain to get the same sharpening treatment as the other parts of this image. So what we can do is take the threshold slider and drag it to the right. When threshold is at 0, everything in the photo is getting the same sharpening treatment. Dragging it to the right sets a higher threshold for what Photoshop considers an edge, and so doing that removed the sharpening from the sky. Now let's look at the radius slider. What radius does is controls the width of these sharpening halos. In other words, how far out from the edge they go. Let's drag the radius slider to the left to reduce the width of the halos until you can hardly see them. Now let's go to the amount slider, which controls the amount of darkness and lightness in these halos. So I'm going to reduce the amount slider until I think the details are sharp, but the halos aren't obvious. Now, to compare a before and after view in the document window, I'll go to the Preview checkbox and uncheck that. And with Preview checked, the details are sharper. I'll click OK to apply these sharpening settings. Because we did this sharpening with a smart filter, we have the flexibility to reopen the Unsharp Mask dialog box at any time by going to the Layers panel and double-clicking Unsharp Mask there. So those are the basics of sharpening in Photoshop. There are other sharpening methods, but often the Unsharp Mask dialog box is the only thing you'll need to get the job done, and it's a great place to practice your new sharpening skills. Saving is a critical step in any photo editing workflow. So let's go over the file formats in which you'll most commonly save your photos. First of all, it's a good idea to have a master editing copy of every file that you work on in Photoshop, and to save that in the native Photoshop format, which is the .psd format. That will retain adjustment layers, like the one that we used here to change the color of this wheel. It will also retain other Photoshop features so that you can come back and re-edit those in the future. To save in the Photoshop format, in the Save As dialog, I'll choose Format or Save As Type, Photoshop, and I'll make sure to check Layers if I have multiple layers in the file, and I'll click Save. And OK. Now let's look at another photo. Let's say that we want to put this edited photo on the web or on a social media site. To do that, it needs to be in the JPEG format. But if I save as JPEG, the layers that you see here, the photo filter layer, which changes the color of the photo, and the background layer will be flattened into one single layer. So I want to make sure that I have my master PSD file, and then I'll save a copy as a JPEG. And notice that layers is not available because the JPEG format, as I said, does not retain layers. And I'll click OK. Now if I were to open that JPEG, you would see only one layer. Let's go ahead and do that. The same is true if I save a file in the PNG format. The PNG format will not retain layers, so in other words, this type layer would be baked into the same layer as the background, but what the PNG format will do is to save transparency. So that means I'll be able to place this against a different background, for example, on a website, and that background will show through where we see a checkerboard here. So let's go ahead and try that. Again, layers is not available. And I'll click OK. And now I'll open that PNG file. And as you can see, the type layer is no longer separate, but we still do have transparency in the PNG file. So that's a look at the most common file formats in which you'll save photos in your Photoshop photo editing workflow.